Welcome to Freedom Window. I'm going to talk about Pennsylvania tonight, but before I do, I just want to ask you to please like this video if you enjoy it, share the video, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the content. All right, now let's talk about Pennsylvania. Let's look at the Target Smart early vote in. You can see the Democrats still have a pretty big advantage in their mail-in and early in-person ballots returned, 68 to 22%. I have applied those numbers to my model, but before we get there, I want to do a county comparison here. Now on the left side here is the 2016 map. It gives you an idea of where the Democratic concentrations of high numbers of votes are. Obviously Philadelphia and Delaware counties, Chester, Montgomery, Bucks, Lehigh, Monroe, and Lackawanna. Now, let's look at the percentages of mail ballots returned in those counties. So in Philadelphia, you've got 74.6%, Delaware only 67.2%, Chester 69.3%, still have a third left. A quarter left in Montgomery, 74.3%. You got 30% left in Bucks, and you have almost 30% in Lehigh. And Monroe County has a third left. And finally, you've got Lackawanna, which they've actually almost at 80%. And then in these counties here, Northampton and Berks, they could go Democratic. They went Republican last time. You still have almost 30% in Berks left, and Northampton has gotten over 80%. Center County is at 81% now. Dauphin County is at almost 80%. And then last we have Allegheny County at 80%. Now here's why I'm bringing all of this up. If you look at the model, well, before we get there, let's just look at it right here. Democrats have returned almost 80% of the ballots that they've requested. Now, I just went through all of the heavy concentration of Democrat counties in Pennsylvania and showed you that they were all, if you average all of those together, they're at about 71.5% ballots returned. Yet, in the statewide total, they're almost to 80%. So what's going on? Most likely, I think the Republicans in these counties, because they do count in the total return, they do count in the total. And there are a good number of Republicans in all of these counties, with the exception of Philadelphia County. There are not many Republicans in that county. I think Republicans have decided to vote in person in many of these counties, which is driving the county total down. And I think the Democrats have decided, obviously, to vote by mail. So you see this disparity between, in the Democratic counties, the average versus the total average. Now, by no means do these counties represent all of the Democrats in Pennsylvania. There's a good number of Democrats in every county in Pennsylvania. But they do represent the vast concentration of them. So let's turn to the model now. What I have done to account for this. You'll recall, if you saw my previous Pennsylvania videos, I said that this column right here, the percent of requested ballots returned, would tell the tale. Well, I'm coming to realize that that's not the case. Because some Republicans, and many have stated this, the party itself has even said, we know that some Republicans are deciding to vote in person rather than send in their mail-in ballot. Rather than just assume that these people, this percentage below the Democrats, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats here, 79% minus 66%, rather than assume that difference will not vote, I'm taking that number and putting it right here in this little green cell. This green cell will get applied to this cell, which is an estimate of the total number of Republicans that can vote on Election Day. What this does is this just assumes that a certain percentage of these people have decided that they're going to vote in person. Makes sense. It's consistent with what we found. Then you might say, but wait a minute. Aren't you using this request early ballot ratio as an indicator of voter intensity and applying it to your Election Day estimate? Yes. Then you might ask, well, doesn't that undermine, when you take this number out of the total vote, doesn't that undermine this assumption? No, and here's why. The number one question that pollsters will ask to determine whether you're a likely voter is, have you thought about the election? Or do you know where you're going to vote? They're asking some question designed to elicit from you an indication that you've thought about the election. Well, if you're looking at an actual data, the earliest possible data that you can collect that gives you a good solid answer on that question, which is, are you thinking about the election, is, did you request a mail ballot? So that is why I'm using this as my likely voter determiner. Okay, so what is the practical impact? Well, let's assume, and this is another change I made, which I need to tell you about. Here the Democrats, they're blowing the lid off, okay? They're already at almost 79% of requested ballots returned. That's higher than I estimated that they would even get to. I didn't think they would get to 80%. So, I've made an adjustment to account for that. I'm now, in this column down here, I am making an overall estimate of where I think that each party will get based on where they're at today. Now, I think the Democrats are going to return 90% of their requested ballots. I think the Republicans will return probably about 82%. I've written here 80. I didn't make the change later, but I think it'll be about 82%. And I assume the independents will also get about 82% of their ballots returned, early mail ballots. What you have to remember is that of those mail ballots, a certain percentage of them will be disqualified. I'm assuming that because Pennsylvania is a state that has always been an election day state primarily, and this is new to them, about 5% of the ballots will be disqualified across the board. So I've dropped the Democrats down to 85% in terms of the calculation. Republicans and independents are down to 78% of the early requested ballots that will actually count. So that's way higher than where I thought we were going to be. So I'm assuming that the Democrats will get 85% of their ultimate vote in. You have to remember, this is the Democrats' best shot, the early vote. The Republicans' best shot is yet to come, and that is Election Day. I believe it's reasonable to assume that if the Democrats are getting 85% of their mail-in ballots returned, the Republicans will get something approaching that number of their Election Day possible total in, something approaching 85%. So remember the change I just told you about, how I took the number in the green cell here, which are the number of Republicans, if the Republicans had voted at the same percentage by mail that aren't voting. I take that number, I put it here in the Republicans' maximum total possibility. It gets multiplied by the likely turnout and the early ballot ratio, and we end up with 2.37 million of a possible 2.87 million to vote on Election Day. That equates to 82%, which is lower than what the Democrats are turning out. Reasonable assumptions all, I think. Where does that leave us? In my most likely scenario, the other two models I've left behind because I've realized that this model is definitely the one, the middle ground model, in the green lettering. The Democrats have 2.92 million voters. The Republicans have 2.98 million voters. And the independents have a little over 500,000 voters. What does that assume in terms of turnout? That assumes 70% of Democrats turnout, which is 8% higher than last time. It assumes that 85% of Republicans turnout, which is about 12 points higher than last time. And it assumes 58% of independents turnout, which is actually lower than last time. But that's not surprising. Independents are not showing the same kind of intensity as partisans are, which is why you've heard over and over again, this is a turnout election. Now, the reason I'm assuming this is based on the multiplier, and it's based on what we're actually seeing on the ground. This translates to a turnout percentage of 45.5% Democrat, 46.4% Republican, and 8% Independent. Which, if you look at the model, looks like this. Now here's why this is so significant. This is what we can take and apply to the models that the polls have built. And then we can test where are we going to come down in relation to the polls. This equates to an R+1 turnout in Pennsylvania. If we have an R+1, let's go look at the polling. Let's start with Franklin and Marshall's model right here. This came out not too long ago, just a few days ago. They assumed a 7-point advantage for Democrats. I think we can eliminate that as a possibility based on my model. They had Biden winning by 6 with a 7-point advantage in turnout. So they obviously found that Trump won independents slightly or got more Democrats than Biden got Republicans. If this is the actual voter ratios that we see, that Franklin and Marshall saw, that equates to a Trump win with an R+1 turnout. Okay, the insider advantage poll. Now, one negative here, the insider advantage, it was 400 likely voters. But it is a similar type model to what we're looking at here, which is basically even split between the parties and a very small number of independents. Now, what he found was that a sizable number of Democrats were voting for Trump, and a 5% less Republicans were voting for Biden. And Trump held his party 87%, Biden held his party 80%. Now, Biden did win independents 59-22, but that's only 8% of the electorate. So that's only a couple of points swing. The real money is in these party distributions. If these are the partisan distributions in Pennsylvania based on the R+1 model, Trump will win big time for that. Fox News. The Fox News model assumed 50% Democrats, 45% Republicans, and 5% independents. We can scrap that, change it to 45D, 46R, 8 or 9% I. That's what my model's showing that we're heading for, if my assumptions are correct. The internals of the Fox News poll show a basically even split between Republicans and Democrats. 89-8 for Biden, 89-9 for Trump, and independents had to split. Now, how do we know the independents split? Because they don't tell us in the internals. We know that because it was a D+5 model, and Biden won by 5. Now, Fox News, they assume too many Democrats in their polls, but the internals of Fox News polls are very good. So I like this model here. And if we apply this model to the turnout that my model is showing, that is a Trump win by a point or two. Last one we're going to look at, Suffolk University. They showed D+6, Biden winning by 7. So again, independents slightly go to Biden. What we're seeing here is it's probably a safe assumption to assume that independents are going to come close to splitting. And what's ultimately going to tell the tale is which candidate can get more of the other guy's party to vote for him. So the picture that we're seeing today, and it's based on the data that we're finding, it's going to be a big partisan turnout in Pennsylvania. It's going to be a low independent turnout as a percentage of the overall electorate. It looks like the Republicans are going to get the edge. So please, like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, and share.